So I'll start out, just have a few disclosures. My background, I'm the acting regional dean of the University of Illinois College of Medicine here in Urbana. I'm the faculty there. My background is internal medicine and infectious disease. I also serve as on the board of regents at the American College of Physicians. I have shot a gun. It was my father's shotgun. He set up a target, on a tree off in the distance. It killed my shoulder. It was really loud. I did it twice, and that was it. I don't own it. We don't own a gun. My comments today, they're my own. I'm not here representing any particular group or the university or the college, but I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I do say I am most grateful for Dr. Curtis Krock's letter to the editor here, which you all received as part of your pamphlet. Dr. Krock, hello, good to see you. I agree completely with everything that you said here. Thank you. I also want to welcome some other colleagues of mine who I know are here too. It's wonderful to see everybody. Okay, so I wanted to share this information with you. Certainly with all the attention being given to mass shootings and everything else, and the terror and the horror associated with all that, I think it's important to keep in mind what happens as far as mortality from firearms in this country is concerned. So this is data from 2016. The blue portion there shows the number of firearm deaths due to suicide. So due to suicide, the other kind of the yellowish on the left, that's all due to other violent deaths due to firearms. But suicides far outnumber, just in pure numbers, the firearm deaths in the United States on an annual basis, and this continues today. So there's almost 40,000 deaths due to firearms annually in the United States, and about 60% or so are due to suicides. Now, there is a panelist who will be speaking more about numbers and the data. That's my husband, hello husband. So you'll hear more about all the numbers and the things shortly. So just want to give you a little perspective. Going back to 2015, this paper was published by the American College of Physicians and published in their flagship journal, the Annals of Internal Medicine. And this was co-authored by representatives from all these different medical societies, as well as the American Bar Association. And remember at the time, it was thought this is quite significant that this may be one of the few papers published where physicians and lawyers are co-authors on an issue like this. And from a physician point of view, we're all excited about having an attorney as a co-author. At any rate, it lays out here what some of the positions were, again, many of which were noted in Dr. Krock's letter to the editor, but things such as universal background checks, eliminating physician gag laws, we'll talk about that in a moment, talking about assault weapons, and then also the need for research to understand the problem better. So importantly, and I think that's one reason why it's so critical to have the support of the ABA with this, is that the ABA confirmed that none of these recommendations conflicted with the Second Amendment. So that was certainly reassuring to us, and again, we'll be hearing more about Second Amendment related things very shortly. So moving up now to this past fall, this paper was published. It was an update of the position of the American College of Physicians, which has been, the ACP has had strong policy in place for 20 years on how to reduce firearm injuries and deaths, and policies supporting that. And this was an update of that policy. So this was printed, published here in late October. And then, as Chuck had mentioned, a tweet went out. The National Rifle Association criticized the ACP and it admonished self-important anti-gun doctors to stay in their lane. Well, needless to say, the medical community just erupted. I truly had no idea how many people were on Twitter that would have even seen this, but what occurred was essentially a Twitter storm. And for those of you who are not familiar with Twitter, these were tweets, these messages, not like emails, but these were like short electronic messages flying out to the world all over the place from all different directions. So this generated a tremendous amount of attention and concern and really outrage. So this launched the hashtag This Is Our Lane, had a movement and group. It's really incredibly inclusive because physicians were saying, wait a minute, this isn't our lane. We deal with this on a daily basis in our professional lives in one way, shape, or form. And you can see here there's a number of different physician specialties which reacted and which are impacted in this way, but also we think about the paramedics, the nurses, housekeeping staff, I mean everybody who's impacted by this, as well as people who survive such incidents, as well as their families, friends, colleagues, and the list goes on. This is one of my favorite tweets, if you will, that came out of this. We are not anti-gun, we are anti-bullet holes in people. I mean, pretty direct and to the point. So, here's some photographs of some of the tweets that came out from the phones. These were taken from the New England Journal article. I did bring 30 copies of this article. They were out here, but this is available online and it's available and open to the world if anyone wants to look at it electronically. The photograph on the left is a chair that a physician working in the emergency room took. This is where she sits to tell family members that their loved one did not make it, their loved one passed away. The middle photograph is one of a trauma bay where the attempt was made to resuscitate someone. I've been in situations like this, not here in Illinois, but prior in Massachusetts, where I was working before coming here. It's not a pretty sight, but it looks essentially like that. And you remember there are people coming in and cleaning up this after the fact. It's traumatizing for everybody who is having to deal with this. The last one there on the far right is a tweet from a colleague of mine in Chicago who tweeted about the shooting there at Mercy Hospital, which also occurred just this past fall. So, going forward, just last month, again, as Chuck had alluded to, there was a call to action published by the ACP, again, co-authored by a number of physician specialty societies, the leaders from these societies, as well as the American Public Health Association. These societies altogether represent a majority of physicians in the United States. This article is also, it made some hard copies, but it's also available online. It's also a review of it, a short review of it is available by podcast, which is also available freely to anyone who wishes to hear that. So in terms of the recommendations, I'll briefly go through these. The first is for background checks for firearm purchases, just supporting universal background checks. So this includes background checks on persons purchasing guns, not only in stores, but also at gun shows, private sales, and all that, just to keep a better track of things. The second is just the really urgent need for more research on this problem, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. The third one touched on intimate partner violence. This was an update from the prior policies. The thought, or the recommendation being that offenders should be prohibited from purchasing or possessing firearms. Fourth is safe storage of firearms. So this is especially for people who own guns, who may have children or adolescents or persons with dementia living in the home with them. But to keep those locked, unloaded and locked in one place and keep the ammunition locked somewhere else. So we'll, if time in the video permits, we'll show you something about that. The next one has to do with mental health. There's been a lot of discussions about mental health recently, and the recommendation here is to support improved access to mental health care, but also to caution against broadly including all individuals with a mental health or substance use disorder in the group of people who should not own firearms. The vast majority of people with mental health disorders are not violent and are not prone to such acts of violence, and I think it's imperative that we be very careful about not broadly lumping everybody into one category and saying they're dangerous. That's just not the case. The next one has to do with extreme risk protection orders. This has been in the news a little bit more recently as well. This has to do with the ability of local law enforcement personnel to be able to take away the guns from persons who present concerning whether it's tweets or posts or other information that may lead one to think that they may be at risk for committing an act of violence. But to do it in such a way so that the guns are temporarily taken away and the appropriate investigation can take place to figure out next steps. But that seems to be gaining a little bit more, I think, bipartisan support in Congress. The next one is physician counseling of patients and gag laws. The most recent place where this was in effect was in Florida, and this was overturned in 2017. But these rules prohibited physicians from speaking with patients in the privacy of an exam room about guns, gun ownership, and how to keep yourself and your family safe. These have been overturned. To my knowledge, there aren't any in effect right now, but we certainly don't want to see those come back. And then the last has to do essentially with assault weapons and how to, and to figure out a way forward to address this issue, certainly in the, within the perspective of mass killings and mass shootings. So I mentioned briefly, looking at my watch here, okay, mentioned briefly the issue of research. We're in a real pickle, if you will, as far as research in this, on these problems and on this issue goes. You can see from this graph, for those of you who can see it, gun violence is this little orange dot down on the bottom, kind of floating out by itself. But in terms of the impact on society and mortality, the amount of federal dollars which are devoted to studying this issue are woefully low compared to things like hypertension, Parkinson's disease, lung cancer, HIV, all these different things. Even motor vehicle accidents. Now there's some data from the CDC that came out earlier this year indicating or stating that the mortality rate from guns is now, I think it's been very close for some time, but it's now, excuse me, slightly higher than it is for motor vehicle accidents. But there's more dollars being spent on studying ways to prevent motor vehicle accidents than there is gun violence now. So until we get more data and better understand the problems and the questions and how best to address it, it's going to remain a very difficult problem to study and understand and figure out next steps. This is one organization, a private organization called affirmresearch.org, or Affirm. But this is a nonprofit private organization which is supported by multiple physician organizations around the country, but to specifically explore the root causes of gun violence and how best to address them. There's a lot of interesting and I think valuable information here on this website. So for anyone who's especially interested, I'd urge you to take a look here at some more information and more details. So it really is a public health crisis. Certainly with the mass shootings, we're all terrified. The random nature of these is just terribly unsettling for, as we all know, all kinds of reasons. Again, we have an epidemic of suicides in this country which outnumber the number of deaths, but all the same, it's a real problem and it is a public health crisis. The approach that the ACP recommends, and I very much agree with and would like to see, is to approach it as a public health problem. We've done this with cigarettes and lung cancer. We've done it with car accidents, increasing the safety of driving our motor vehicles. We've done it with HIV. We've been doing it with breast cancer, all these different things. We first identify the problem, we identify the risk and protective factors, we develop and test different interventions in terms of what works, what doesn't, and then for the ones that work, we assure widespread adoption. And then, of course, we have to continue to educate ourselves. So I think being here at seminars like this to hear all kinds of different very important perspectives and learn more about the problem, I think could be of course, it will be incredibly helpful and valuable as we go forward. This is a wonderful little video. It is from Twitter. The link is on the bottom for those of you who can see it. It was posted by Dr. Joseph Sacron, who was one of the first to respond in the Twitter storm saying, wait a minute, this is our lane. He's a trauma surgeon, but it's a kind of a cartoon little video depicting how to, kind of the consequences of what happens if guns are not stored safely at home, instructions for how to store guns safely at home, but it also really conveys his experience. Like, this is not fun. This is the worst part of his job, to have to go out and tell a family member that their child did not make it because of this terrible accident that happened at home. So anyway, it's quite powerful.
2 units of blood. Let's go. We're losing her.
Come on. Stay with me. You can make it. This could have been prevented.
Come on, sister. Let's play. We'll be back. Do you want to play dress up? Here, put this on. How do I look? Super cute. Look at me.
Girls, what's going on up there?
Nothing.
Here I go.
Me and my wife were out to dinner when we got the call from the babysitter saying that our oldest daughter was hurt. We rushed here as quick as we could.
What are you doing? Is that Mom's jewelry box? Whoa! Don't fall, she'll hear us. Help me. Got it.
There was severe damage to her organs. She lost a massive amount of blood. The damage was just too severe. There was nothing anyone could do. I'm so sorry.
Oh no, oh no, please tell me that's not true. No! How could she die? I demand to know what happened.
Wow, it's heavy. Let me hold it. Wait your turn.
Everything looks great for your checkup. If you have a gun in your home, is it locked?
No, but it's hidden.
The best way to safely store a firearm is locked and unloaded in a safe with the ammunition stored separately for everyone's safety.
Girls, what's going on up there?
Nothing. Help me. Got it. Oh, it's not opening. Then let's find Mom's jewelry box.
The best treatment is prevention.
So, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. The issue of gun regulation or not seems to most people like a pretty straightforward topic, at least until you get the damn lawyers involved. And when it comes to guns, the most important legal variable, of course, is the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, everyone agrees that the Second Amendment puts some limits on the government's ability to regulate, to limit ownership, possession, use. The fighting ground is how much does the Constitution restrict the government's ability to pass and enforce gun control measures. Now, as I know most of you know, the text of the Second Amendment is quite brief. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, the text of the Second Amendment is in many ways a validation of Mrs. Nason, my fifth grade English teacher, who told us that unclear writing leads to unclear thinking. And the Second Amendment is unclear, right? Generations of scholars and advocates have debated how the first part of the Second Amendment relates to the second part. The first part says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma. And then the second part says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, those who argue for a narrow interpretation of the Second Amendment, that is, those who argue that greater gun control is permitted by the Constitution, argue that the first part, the first clause, limits the second, and that it's only when people are part of a well-regulated militia that the right to bear arms is protected. Stated differently, this view says that gun ownership is a collective right as part of a militia. Now, for a time, the Supreme Court appeared to agree with this view. In the late 1930s, two guys, Jack and Frank, carried a sawed-off shotgun across state lines from Oklahoma into Arkansas and were convicted under the National Firearms Act. Now they said our convictions are barred by the Second Amendment, but the Supreme Court said actually no, it's not. It said that prohibiting shotguns with a barrel of less than 18 inches bears no reasonable relationship to maintaining a well-ordered militia, and so the law was okay. Now this supported the view that it's a collective right, not an individual right. But then, as I know many of you know, in 2008, the Supreme Court said that's not what the Second Amendment means. In District of Columbia versus Heller, fairly well-known case in this area, a police officer wanted to keep a firearm in his home, a handgun in his home in D.C. And he wasn't allowed to, he wasn't given a permit to do so, and so he said the Second Amendment has been violated. I get to keep a gun in my home. And now the Supreme Court says, well, we've looked at this pretty carefully, and we think that first clause, the militia clause, is prefatory. And it tells why firearms are important, but it doesn't limit the so-called operative clause, the second part, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, that shall not be infringed. And so the Supreme Court concluded in Heller that the Second Amendment defines an individual right to own firearms, or to something about firearms, but individual, you can have a constitutionally protected right even outside the context of being part of a militia. Now, Heller is an extremely important decision, one that has to be the starting point of any discussion of what restrictions are permitted on firearms. But I think it's really important not to overstate the role of Heller in particular and the Second Amendment in general in discussing this issue, because at least in my view, the Second Amendment is neither as protective as gun advocates would like, nor as restrictive as gun control advocates fear. Now, I say that for a couple of reasons. First, no constitutional right is absolute, no matter what the text of the Constitution says. I kind of make fun of the wording of the Second Amendment as being obscure, but even when the Constitution is very clear and very specific, we still don't take it literally. Think about the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. That sounds pretty clear, except we don't believe it. I mean, we still make laws. Everyone agrees that defamation laws are okay, obscenity laws are okay, grand jury secrecy laws are okay, national security. These are all laws abridging free speech. And yet we say, yeah, that's perfectly fine. So no reason to think that the Second Amendment, which is much more awkwardly written, let's say, than the First Amendment, should be any different. More to the point, Heller recognizes this. Heller, the Supreme Court decision that said it's an individual right, recognized this. Justice Scalia's opinion for the court says that like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose. Right? And in fact, in the decades since Heller, courts have been quite willing to uphold gun control, broadly defined, gun control measures against Second Amendment challenges. So I've just listed a few here. Laws that say you can't possess a firearm if you're under 18, that's fine within the meaning of the Second Amendment. Can't buy from a dealer if you're under 21, Second Amendment doesn't bar that. If you're a convicted felon and you can't possess a firearm, that's been challenged on Second Amendment grounds, but said, nah, that's fine. No firearms for, and this is the unfortunate language of the federal statute, for mental defectives or people who are in psychiatric institutions, of course, those are fine. Banning assault weapons, most courts, most times have said, yeah, that's okay. In other words, there's all kinds of room for gun control regulation, except now, well, not just now, but You still have to run the Second Amendment gauntlet if you're a legislator interested in regulating the use, possession, licensing, and so on of guns. But there's a lot of room to do so still, room that the courts will uphold even in light of the Second Amendment. But if it really is the political arena and not the legal arena that causes the difficulty for those who are interested in regulating use and possession of firearms, there's, as you know, a lot of reason to be discouraged on both sides of the debate. The first reason is, of course, there is no debate on the issue of gun control, about restricting the number of guns available in the civilian population. That discussion is over. You'll hear more sophisticated statistics than mine, but the best estimate I've seen is that there's close to 400 million guns in civilian hands in this country, or one for every man, woman, and child in this country, with 67 million left over. The proposals that you hear about reducing the amount of firearms, right, banning assault weapons. Ask Beto O'Rourke how that one's going for him. Even if you get that, even if you get weapons buybacks, there are 20 to 25 million background checks being done every year for legal possession of new guns. You're not going to take, in any significant way, not going to reduce the total amount of guns in society in any meaningful way. But even if the efforts at gun regulation has been moved to, let me be uncharitable and say, moved to the margins. It's not really about restricting gun ownership. It's about whether you can regulate bump stocks and whether you can restrict bullets that can penetrate bulletproof vests. There really is not much that is recognizable as a debate on these issues. Those who favor greater restrictions on guns and those who favor greater freedoms to own guns debate this issue in the same way that we debate abortion or the chief or other great issues of the day, which is to say not much at all. It's not really a debate, it's people shouting past each other. And this was captured for me in a meeting I was at one time about these, about gun violence. And the speaker said, we start from such fundamentally different places. He said, for those who are Second Amendment advocates, guns represent freedom, security, and recreation. They are instruments of parents teaching their children self-reliance and individual responsibility. It's about my niece, who when she goes to pick up the pizza at the carryout shop, brings a pistol with her because she says, I don't think anything bad's going to happen, but if it does, I am not going to be a victim. That view never seems to cross paths with the second group who feel quite passionately, for whom, as the speaker put it, guns represent violence, fear, and heartbreak. They're the ones who don't let their children play outside at night. They are the clerks at stores in high crime areas, and they're the ones whose children took their own life with a gun that happened to be accessible in the house. Now, of course, this lack of a thoughtful exchange of ideas is not unique to guns. It's kind of hard to find it anywhere in society, at least outside of this room. But it's still too bad because there are some issues that are hard and subtle and really require more research and some adult consideration. So let me close with just two examples of where I have been surprised in studying this issue and areas where I wish that we had a lot more research, a lot more development of ideas, a lot more ability to discuss ideas. The first is, as you heard just mentioned, the study of laws. They're called red flag laws. You didn't use that term, but it's these are the laws that say when there are certain characteristics, it causes us concern that the person who displays these characteristics might be more prone to violence than others. And so we were talking through some of the triggers for these red flag laws to take effect, where they could temporarily take the person's gun away from them. And one of the variables we were considering was mental illness, right? And so I'm sitting there thinking, well, if people are having, manifesting real mental health problems, it might make sense to take the guns away, even if temporarily. Until someone on the committee pointed out that there's an awful lot of people where the issue of gun ownership is so important to them that if you take the guns away, they won't seek mental health treatment. They would rather avoid it entirely than run the risk of losing their gun. Now, did that end the discussion? No. Did it inform the discussion? You bet. It was a point at least I never thought of, and the kind of thing that requires very careful and mature thought. Second, I think there's a lot more to be heard from a group that courts, and the Supreme Court in particular, tends to care a lot about, and in this case it's the police. One of the real hidden costs, I think, that come from freedom to own and possess guns is the corrosive effect on police-public relations. Police know that they confront the most heavily armed civilian population in the world. And on average in this country, there is one police officer a week who is killed by gunfire in the line of duty. Now, when you have a job like that, you might approach situations where your life would be at risk with a bit less civility and maybe even a bit more aggressiveness than we would prefer in an ideal world. During that same period, the 3 years that I looked at for police deaths in the line of duty by firearms, there was slightly more, but still, on average, one unarmed civilian who was shot and killed by a police officer each week. Now, we don't have to drill down very far to see the relationship between those numbers, that when the police or community relations are constantly on edge, in part because lethal force can happen quickly and unexpectedly, but there's a problem that doesn't get, at least in my view, enough attention and enough study. So, despite the impression we get from the popular press, the police actually are still a very well-regarded entity in this society. They have a higher level of confidence among most Americans than, this may be damning with faint praise, but than many other professions and governments and the justice system in general. But we need the research. We need to find out, and mostly we need people who can talk without shouting, who can study problems without fear, without losing their job, without being voted out of office. And maybe if we do, we can find a little bit better balance of the right of gun ownership to the interest in security that all of us, including gun owners, value. That's what I got. Thank you.
Professor Sheldon Jacobson.
Well, you're a very special group. How many of you realize how special you are? You've taken the time out of your schedule to come and hear a discussion of people who offer a point of view on a very emotionally charged, visceral issue. You may have come here today because you want to confirm some of your points of view, or possibly challenge them, or maybe just learn something new. And because of that, you are special, and I thank you for taking the time to be here. I am in the computer science department here at the University of Illinois. I do data science within the broad field of algorithms and artificial intelligence, and I am particularly interested in being able to tease out insights and information from data so we can get a better understanding of what the data says. Now, as a little bit of a background, I grew up in Canada. I have never shot a firearm, which I suspect is fairly unusual in the United States. I was once on a group tour, and they asked that question, how many of you have not shot a firearm? And out of a group of 35 of us, there was only 2, myself and some other person who, for some reason, never shot a firearm, yet was from the United States. As I said, my research focuses on data, and in particular data-driven decision-making when there is a plethora of uncertainty. So we really can't simply connect the dots because there's fog around the data. Most importantly, I really have a great spouse. You just heard from her, Dr. Janet Jokala, and we have some very spirited conversations at home, as recently as last night as we were going to bed. And we do agree on just about everything, but occasionally I get it wrong. I assure you I'm going to have a great dinner tonight. So what are the issues? And I look at things from a purely data point of view. And when you look at it at firearms, certainly the data suggests that suicides are the number one way in which people kill themselves using firearms. They do lead to a large number of unnecessary deaths, and they're certainly involved in criminal activity. If people have a gun, they seem to be bolder and more willing to take risks and actions that they would not otherwise. So from this, the obvious conclusion is that you have to get rid of firearms. Well, let's look at the reality of the situation. We're not going to get rid of 390 million guns today. It's just not possible. And the real issue is, how do you get the guns out of the hands of the wrong people who are going to cause harm for us? And of course, the types of firearms are very diverse. I'll talk a little bit about that. So there's not really an obvious conclusion that we can draw and elicit from those statements. So Professor Leopold very well discussed the Second Amendment, so I'm not going to discuss it any more than simply giving it again. But the real question that we try and understand is, how can the principles still be preserved in changing times? And how can the data help us gain that understanding? So let's look at some of this data so we can get a bit of a perspective on it. So I was able to extract some pieces of information across a variety of sources. And as a data scientist, it's very easy to get a piece of data that you like. And that, I tell that to my graduate students when we're analyzing data, one source is insufficient. We need multiple sources that will corroborate a point of view so that we can in fact see exactly what the data is saying. So although I do provide only one single source for this data, we have corroborated across multiple sources, or we would not be talking about it today. And as you can see, and I've given you a list of the countries with the top 10 civilian gun-owning countries. And guess what? The United States is certainly number one by a long shot. And then we have a variety of other countries, some of which we don't hear very much about, or we often hear about them in possibly a negative context. Canada makes the top 10 list. Iceland does as well, and I point that out for a particular reason, as we'll see. Because the view is, of course, we have too many guns. Well, we do have a lot of guns. I don't know if we have too many guns, but we have a lot of guns. What about violent gun deaths per capita, or per 100,000 people? So we once again look at some data along these lines. And the United States kind of falls in the bottom end of the high group. I haven't put all of the countries, of course, there's quite a few in the world. If you look at Western Europe, we would certainly be on the high end. Germany is around 1 per 100,000 people. And then you have Iceland, which has a lot of guns, but has relatively few violent gun deaths per 100,000 people. And then you go all the way down to countries like Japan, which has almost none, and Singapore. And we see that there is quite a range. I don't think the United States would want to put itself in the same group as El Salvador. Yet, in reality, we are not even close to that, but certainly we're not in the same group as Japan. So the data speaks to us and tells us at least what some of the trends are right now. What about gun manufacturers? Well, we produce a lot of guns. It's a big industry in the United States. And as you see this trend, there was a bottoming out just after the beginning of our current century, and then there was this big climb all the way up to 2013. And it did seem like, boy, people are really starting to get interested in owning more guns because the gun manufacturers are producing many more guns. And then we had this spike up and down period, which we are now currently in. In fact, 2017 was the lowest number of guns manufactured since 2011. At the same time, if you look at the distribution or composition of the guns, you actually get a slightly different picture. Because pistols have been somewhat static, yet miscellaneous firearms, which can involve a variety of things, possibly very, very powerful weapons, has actually been growing, certainly when you compare it to 10 and 15 years ago. So this gives us a little bit of an idea of what's possible when it comes to people possessing firearms, as well as the types of firearms that people are possessing. What about background checks? As Professor Leopold had mentioned, we're having around 25 million background checks per year. So a lot of people are being checked and validated. What people often don't realize is that only a small percentage of these people are actually not allowed to own a gun, in the order of 100,000 out of 25 million. There's also been this slight tick downward from 2016 to 2017. And once again, this is what the data says. That's all I'm giving you here, is what the data is saying. Now, my own personal research, I got involved in analyzing mass murders in the United States, because I was traveling and I saw this great data set that had been reported in USA Today, and I thought there has to be something that we can tease out from that information and help us understand what's happening. And what we came to the conclusion is that yes, there are models that will in fact give us a clue of how mass murders are occurring, but the models suggest that they're completely unpredictable in their timing as well as in their volume, which kind of was bad news. It was good news and bad news for us. So the best strategy that one could glean from this is that one needs to deter people from acting in this way, and then preparing law enforcement and communities to respond rapidly to mitigate the losses and the damage from these. So this became a very big issue. I wrote an op-ed which was just published exactly a month ago today in the Morning Consult, which was Data Dispels 2 Common Myths About Mass Killings. Because people get the idea that they're happening so frequently that we are all in danger. And the reality is that the data does not support that. The data does not support that. What was interesting, when this article came out in 2017, it was covered in the media quite a bit, and I was invited to be a guest on the National Rifle Association television network. I didn't know the National Rifle Association had a television network. So my very intelligent and capable wife was horrified that I would accept such an invitation. And my response was quite simple. If I don't go on that program and tell our story, they're going to tell it without me. And they're invariably going to misrepresent the point of view that we wanted to bring across. So I was a guest, and you can probably find it on the NRA TV archive, if you're so interested. And they kept trying to lead me down a path, and I kept trying to tell them what our research was. And we just kept moving in different directions. But they thanked me for coming on. They haven't invited me back since, and I am not losing a lot of sleep over that. Let's look at mass killings, just to give you an idea of what we've been looking at. So from 2006 to 2017, the first column is the number of mass killings. The second column are the number of people who have actually perished in these incidences. Mass killings are not a big part of the total number of people who died due to firearms in the United States. This weekend, there will be more people killed on the highways in the United States than the number of people who will be killed in mass killings in a given year. Those are the facts. Those are the realities. 2006 had the largest number of mass killings in the last 12 years, and then followed by 2008 and 2009. Although in the column, the last one to the right, you see that the number of people being killed is actually growing, and we see that 2017 was actually quite high. The other thing to note is that mass killings involve firearms, knives, arson, and blunt items. People are killed with very, very large blunt items, and that is horrific to think about. But in reality, 75% of all the mass killings involve a firearm. So they are certainly the targets. And these focus specifically on mass shootings, which is the subset of mass killings for the last, as you can see, 6 years, up to 2019 to date. And as we look at the numbers, the trend is not growing all that much. If you look at the last 2 columns, though, this gives you the total number of shootings. That is often referred to as mass shootings, but they're not. They're just shootings where people may be injured and not killed, and the number of victims certainly is larger, but still a very modest number. In fact, here are 3 mass shootings that were not widely reported. And I'm putting them up here because they're all, in fact, quite local in who they affected, although nobody would want to be in these situations. They are all as heinous as all the other mass killings that we hear about in the mass media. But what these are not are public killings. Because once we get into the public, we start thinking about the shopping mall, the Walmart, the restaurant, the mall, the school, the church, the synagogue, where we could have been there. And that's what frightens us. Yet those, although they are reported very widely, are actually not the largest number of such events, based on what the data says. Now, the results of these shootings, as we see, in the shootings with a death versus the shootings with injury, the first number tells you how many there were, and there's pretty much an even balance between shootings which either have a death or shootings which have no death, or just injuries. And the actual number of people killed, as you can see, 2017 was a particularly bad year, 482 people. That includes mass killings, but also includes people where only one person was killed. If you look at injuries, as you can see, it's well over 1,000, almost as high as 2,000 in 2017. This is what the data says. This is what the data indicates. If we look at the breakdown, and Dr. Jokla, my wife, certainly expounded upon that, suicides is the dominant way that firearms are being used for destruction. Homicides are the second group, which includes the small number of mass killings, and then 1305 includes miscellaneous, including people who are killed by law enforcement officers on the order of 500 a year. There's a little bit, military killings, a relatively small number. In terms of what is being used, handguns are by far the dominant weapon of choice in these events. Then shotguns and rifles, and then lastly other guns, which should include some very, very powerful weapons. So what may work? Turns out there was a wonderful article in the Journal of General Internal Medicine. I'm going to get in your lane, Dr. Jokla. I hope you don't mind. And they did a very nice statistical analysis of some very nice data to try and glean what are the dots that can be connected. And here's what they were able to extract. Universal background checks, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, were associated with a very significant reduction in overall homicide rates. So making sure that every single person has been validated is actually a good thing. What else? A violent misdemeanor laws. So if you have been convicted by a violent misdemeanor and you then are prohibited from getting a gun, then that also reduces firearm-related homicides. On the other hand, shall issue laws, which means that if someone has an inkling that someone shouldn't have a gun, and they inform law enforcement and said, this person shouldn't have a gun, if there's a shall issue law, they can't be prevented from getting a gun. And that has an association with an increase in firearm-related homicides. This is similar in spirit to people having weapons and are available when needed. What may not work? Well, there's a lot of things that may not work. Permitless carry laws for concealed weapons. You'd think, okay, people can carry them hidden, that would be great. Doesn't seem to have any effect. Gun trafficking prohibited. So that means that also doesn't seem to have much effect. Stand your ground law. This is the one I think what I misstated, but this one is much more, if you're in a situation that you're going to protect your turf, hey, you can protect it. Put those laws in place, doesn't seem to make a difference. Assault weapon bans and large capacity ammunition magazine bans also don't seem to have much impact. I thought this study was very insightful and used the data appropriately to come up with some very interesting and cogent points. Now, my background, one of the things that I did in 2003 is proposed an idea to the TSA called multi-level passenger pre-screening. In 2011, they called it TSA pre-check. I am very, very interested and involved in issues related to this. And one of the things that the Transportation Security Administration likes to report is the number of firearms that they catch at checkpoints. Does anybody have their firearm caught at a checkpoint? If you have, let me know later. It turns out it's quite egregious. In 2017, we saw almost 4,000 such firearms which were drawn. But here's a very interesting question, and understanding how the TSA works. How many of these people were TSA pre-check passengers? The answer is not publicly reported, although I'm able to extract from public data and put together the pieces of the puzzle, because I know how the puzzle was put together, that the answer is very few, if not zero, very close to zero. And you start to think, gee, maybe we can create a risk-based concept for gun ownership. Because the very principles that are used to make sure that you can get on an airplane safely are those the same principles that could be used to make sure that gun use is also done safely. One of the people who was responsible for implementing PreCheck, who is now retired, I asked him, did this ever come up in conversation, creating a universal PreCheck which would extend the background process for TSA PreCheck to gun screening? And he said it never was, which I thought was very, very unusual. I think it could be a painless way to actually do universal background checks. Just a couple of slides to wrap up, some foods for thought. Are there unintended consequences of gun bans and restrictions? I do not have the answer to that, because there always seems to be unintended consequences. I don't know what they would be, but I think we have to ask all of those questions. One-size-fits-all policies rarely work, nor do they appease anyone. Yet everybody wants a one-size-fits-all policy. And I think we have to think a little more globally. The other thing that I do believe is that this is a top-down problem because it affects people and our nation so broadly. Yet in many ways, a grassroots, bottom-up solution is probably going to be what works. And lastly, some stretch thoughts. There is not only more gun violence in our society, there's just more violence in our society, period. This has been a trend that's going on, and guns are just part of that. And I always ask, what part does social media contribute to this, and what part are our political leaders of both parties contributing to such a tone? And lastly, is there an underlying me-first attitude in society that is fueling the them versus us thinking? And is this part of the problem? Something to review. Thank you, man.
So, when I was tapped by Wesley on this very, very sensitive topic of gun violence, it was right around the midst of the time that I started a mother's group. And so, when I started to put together this presentation, one of the things I wanted to think about and how would I convey this message, and what came out was the title, Inserting Voice. Because oftentimes, the voices get lost and shuffled with all the politics and the varying things that go along with that, right? So I invited a few of the members out, and I would like to recognize them right now. Miss Angie O'Neill, and that's my mother, Miss Rhoda Mitchell, and then also Miss Yvonne Johnson, who's going to come and just say a few words. But I thought it was very important that we put a face to what I've been seeing in my community here in Champaign over the last few years. And so I would be remiss if I didn't invite them so that you all can see exactly the things that are happening in our community. Me, myself, I lost my brother to gun violence August of last year, 2018. So I know what that feels like, and I'm a witness of seeing my mother and her struggles, trying to get through that. So with that being said, I also like to just invite Ms. Yvonne Johnson up front so she can talk about a little bit about her experiences.
Good afternoon. My name is Yvonne Johnson. I am the parent of David C. Sankey, who was killed August 28, 2018. He was 20 feet from my front door when my son was killed. When I look at the news and I see gun violence and kids that got killed, we always turn the channel and, we don't think of nothing, until it hit home. I am a broken parent because I did everything right with David, I don't know how to be fixed. I came to Marla for help because I didn't have an outlet. I didn't have nowhere to go. It's like when you bury your kid You know, everybody is around. We're gonna do this, and we're gonna be here, and oh, Miss Johnson, don't worry about it. And I don't have family here. I don't have nobody. It was nobody but me and David here. And after I buried my baby, it was like raid. They started running away, you know, and telling me, you know, they was gonna do this and that. So I had went to Marlon and I asked them, I'm like, you know, you need to do something. You know, we need to do something in this community because I am broken. From August of last year, I have lost 38 pounds laying down in my bed when I shouldn't have to do that. I should have had somewhere to go, someone to talk to. I have a psychiatrist. My psychiatrist said he can't fix that. That's a grieving process. And if we had somewhere to go to talk about this with other mothers, we'll be better off. I know I would. I can't speak for another mother, but I know I would. And I just wish y'all, all in the community, come together and help us with this. We need the community out here to help us. You know, we need this. You know, we need y'all to come out and help us. And thank y'all very much.
All right, so, again, thanks, Yvonne. So if you look at the title of that slide right there, they're kind of centered around what my talk is going to be. It's going to be two parts. And the first part is exactly what Yvonne is talking about. Some of the trauma that comes from, you know, the pain, the discomfort. So in this title, it says, for those who can't see it, I'll just read it. It says, no one's entry point into violence is committing it. So if we just think about that for a second, what is this, the entry point? That's a critical question that we need to ask all of ourselves. All right, so the current climate of gun violence. So this is something that I thought about because, again, my own lived experiences have led me to this here model: death, destruction, and unhealed trauma. And that's bilateral. It goes both ways. The unhealed trauma then reproduces the death and destruction. And it's a continuous loop. It's always iterative. And at what point can that be broken? So untreated trauma experiences the spirits of confusion, disorientation, isolation, anger, and then the overwhelming desire for relief. As I mentioned, I watched my family go through this just about a year ago. I've seen other mothers. I've seen just the community at whole. So these are things that you can't turn your back towards or your blind eye to because it's happening. I think I was at a community coalition meeting. They said that I think there's been like upwards to 35 murders or something like that in the last 5 years here in Champaign. So when you have a problem, of course, we all want to think about what's the resolution. But when you talk about gun violence and what's the resolution of that, we've heard several other speakers talk about the research, coming from a research perspective, and all the data, and just following the data. So one of the things I did, being a grad research assistant myself, is I'm more on a qualitative level. I like to get to the ground, and try to figure some of these things out. I think Dr. Jacobson mentioned the grassroots, bottom-up approach, and that's exactly the approach that we've taken at First Followers and with some of the mothers. So ask yourself, to what extent does the following industries contribute to or combat gun violence? We heard some comments about the healthcare system. I want to talk about the educational institutions and also the economic systems. And that little blurb down at the bottom basically says, structures of oppression are meant to produce, reinforce, reproduce, and foster violence, which in turn creates more and more trauma. So the second part of my speech or my talk today is just going to center around a group of young men that I've been working with for the last 2.5, 3 years, and we call it Go Mad. So GOMAD is an acronym for Go Make a Difference. Go make a difference in yourself, your family, your community, and the systems at large. So this is one of the things that I talk about as far as the grassroots bottom-up approach. You have to go and get into the trenches to kind of figure out what the situations are. You can't sit at a 55,000-foot level and really come up with all the answers that you need. You have to go down to where the issues are. So this is one of the a developed solution to combat and transform gun violence. So just to talk about the group over the last 2.5, 3 years, here's some demographic information. So over the last 2.5 years, I've had 20 participants to take place in our program, our GOMAD program. All of them were between the ages 18 and 24-year-old African-American males. And oftentimes that's who you see either in front of the trigger or behind the trigger, unfortunately. So amongst the group, 85% of the young men have been involved with the criminal justice system at some point in time. They haven't even hit their 25th birthday. And out of that 85%, 40% have served prison time. And I reiterate, they haven't even hit their 25th birthday. 40% have no high school diploma or GED. And none of the participants have held a steady full-time or part-time job for 6 months. So those are some of the things that when we talk about data, what really leaps off the page, right? It's the education system, the economic development. Those two things, two of the three things that I mentioned earlier, along with the health industry. And I'm gonna stay in my lane with that one, so I don't know much about it. All right, so one of the things we were able to do, and this is just an example of the curriculum that we have, but I must give a shout out to some of my first followers, mentors, and my co-director, James Kilgore. So we've come up with some creative strategies to try to reach these individuals. And so we have a curriculum that we take them through that we call critical consciousness. And critical consciousness is a pedagogy that goes back to Paulo Freire, who's a philosopher and educator, a Brazilian philosopher and educator who I study in the College of Ed quite often. So just to read this case study, because oftentimes just sitting down with the individuals or with the young men, oftentimes what you see is that the world is just moving so fast for them. They don't take time to stop, think, they just react. And oftentimes they're reacting out of emotion. So I think it was last week we had a case study that we drafted up just to sit down and see what kind of response that we would get from the young men on how to combat some of these situations. Because I know for a fact here in Champaign, a lot of the gun violence that goes back and forth is all through retaliation. Oftentimes not as through retaliation. One person does something, and the next person needs to get back to them, or the next group, or the next clique. So it just goes back and forth. All right, so the case study reads this, and I apologize for the really small print if you can't read it, but I'll read it. A group of basketball buddies are playing basketball at a neighborhood court when one of the friends get into an on-court altercation with a guy who is known to be a drug dealer and to have a heavy influence within a gang. During the altercation, another young man who knows the group of basketball players or friends steps in and brandishes a gun to back the drug dealer down. The drug dealer walks off promising he would take care of the situation at a later date. Hours later, the house where the group of basketball players are staying or hanging out gets shot up. What should they do? So these are real life scenarios. Although this is a case there, it was real life, my own personal experience when I was 23, 24 years old. So what do you do? So as we posed this question to the group of young men, we spoke about it for over an hour, and it could have kept going on and on and on about what do we do? How do you handle these situations? But I can also say with the group of young men that I come in contact with, when you really sit down with them and you dig deep into what their situation and circumstances are, you really start to see that there's a lot of things missing. For an example, there's a young man right now that's part of our group who has a gun case. But his whole thing is And like he shared with the group, not just with me, he shared with the group, he said, I'm broken, I need help. He doesn't know where to go and where to turn to. But he explained that, I really need help. I know exact words, I know I'm messed up, and I know I need to see somebody. And this young man is 24 years old. So these are some of the things that we encounter as we take that bottom-up approach in trying to figure out some of these things. And here, as we talked about in this scenario or this case study, we're here with some of the guiding questions. What are some contributing factors that caused this situation to escalate? Number two, how should the group respond? That's a big question, right? How do you respond to something like that? What are some ways this situation could have been avoided? Very simple questions, but very complex and complicated, if you really think about where they're coming from and the culture that they're living in. So some of the things that we talk about as far as solutions come from a social theory model. The macro, meso, and micro. All right, the three levels. Now, the macro level, inclusive and responsive healthcare methods. And when I say the macro level, that's a level that a lot of these systemic or structural institutions are. Meaningful education reform, economic development, or opportunities. The meso level is exactly what we're doing here today. Community engagement, sharing each other's research, sharing our experiences, and just pooling together all your resources. And finally, the micro level. So at the micro level, most times it deals with the individual. But one of the things I would really caution a lot of professionals that's out there, whether it's healthcare, whether it's social services, or whatever that looks like, is that we can't approach a situation such as this in a deficit mindset. Meaning we can't victim blame, because oftentimes individuals or these young men are victims of their circumstances. So these sub-bullet points are 4 different organizations that I know of that's doing tremendous work in the community trying to change that gun violence narrative. Like I said, the research or the program that we're running we're 3 years in, 2.5 years in, but we're starting to see some early stages of turning this thing around. It's going to take a long time, but I might not be able to see it, but at least I can be at the front end to really start that new dynamic. So those are my comments, and I appreciate you again for coming out and sharing your time with us this Sunday afternoon. Thank you.
So good afternoon. I know we're getting late in the day, and thank all of you for coming out today to hear us, and thank Wesley for putting this on. It really is a very timely and important subject and topic, and just appreciate you being here. I was concerned Sunday afternoon that we wouldn't have much of a crowd, so thank you again. We've heard some great information today. Maybe what I can do to connect is maybe just talk about our local issue as it relates to guns and gun activity in our community. I'm recently back from a 3-day conference in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Last night I got back, and this conference spent the entire time talking about community violence, what communities across the Midwest region were dealing with, solutions, programs, and projects that communities were taking on to address this issue. And so while I heard some great things, some of the projects I heard reinforced a lot of the work that we're doing here locally to address our gun issue, but it just reinforced really that we're not in this alone. This is a national crisis and epidemic that cities and communities are in and trying to figure out how to address. We started seeing our increase in gun violence in 2015. I'm not saying we didn't have gun activity and people were not choosing to solve their conflict with guns before then, but our increase went from one level to the next. And I can remember some of those early meetings then council person, Marlon, and a number of us were taking place, and now as Mayor Marlon, and addressing this issue has been a priority of hers, and I just want to publicly say thank you for your leadership that you provided us. So what really is the difference today is how we're choosing to address it and deal with it. It used to be, oh, it's only happening over there, it's happening to those group of people, or this group, or that group, and we separated it from ourselves. And so, because we didn't know, and we weren't directly impacted, it was not seen as a community problem and issue. We don't have that as a luxury anymore. Our gun violence is impacting all of us, our kids' friends. The impact in the schools is dramatic. The impact on campus is dramatic. The impact in our world is dramatic. And so it's interesting as I travel around and speak and talk now, we have to talk about safety in every space that we have and we are in. If this church and this space is not realizing that we have a mass gathering, and with the amount of hate that's done based on religion and beliefs and those types of things, and if we aren't thinking about security in every space we're in, we are fooling ourselves. There's just too many circumstances and scenarios that are taking place every day that lets us know we no longer have the luxury. When I heard the gun numbers of how many guns are on the streets, and I'm one of those that said, we need to get assault weapons off the streets. Why do we need those, right? Those are for weapons of war. But it was very humbling to hear that data and that information. So as a community, I do like to pat ourselves on the back a little bit, because I believe we are in the forefront of change and accepting this as an issue. And so forums like this are critical. I speak all the time, and I always say we're not going to normalize gun activity in our community. We're not going to say that this is just something that happens and then we move on to the next thing as if it's not a crisis and not important. So we have a couple of different things that we've done here as a community that I want to share with you. So when we started seeing our gun related activity, we weren't prepared as a community. So what I like to give the example of is a natural disaster. So if we have a tornado, we have a fire, we have a flood, any of these natural disasters, the Red Cross comes in, we know what church has, supplies, we know who will house the families. United Way comes in and puts money, and all of you great people contribute money to your church, who makes a big donation, and it goes to work on a natural disaster. Community violence, there is no structure, no infrastructure set up that way to allow us to be able to respond. And I think that's the real key and opportunity for us. So I know a couple of you have said, Tracy, what can I do? I'd like to be more involved. So one of the things I want to share you about is something we've created called our Community Coalition. So the Community Coalition is made up of just interested community members. Our faith community is a big part of what we're doing through the coalition. But it's also the only place that I'm aware of in my 20 plus years of doing work in the community where law enforcement, our school systems, our parks, University of Illinois, Parkland, our funders are all at the table to talk about how we address some of our community's most difficult social and economic issues. Gun violence has risen to its own priority for us through the coalition. So we meet the second Wednesday of each month at the Holiday Inn, formerly Hawthorne Suites on South Neal. It's a fantastic meeting. We have about 140 community members out every month. There's a number of really organic ways for you to be involved with committees, working on issues and topics. And it really is a dynamic space that if it works for you, you should feel comfortable coming and participating in the Community Coalition. So, at the Coalition, we're talking about gun violence. but we're also talking about a lot of systemic and structural things that you've been hearing about today. So we do, as a community, as society, has to, and this was again something reinforced at this conference, is that we've got far too many neighborhoods and communities that have been left unattended far too long. So most of these communities are poor, they're communities of color. We have a number of those pockets here in our community, in Champaign and in Urbana, that we as a community, as a society, have not addressed the supports. So access to resources, training, education. You know, we heard all the panelists touch on a number of different subjects and topics that all contribute. The subject and topic of race is something we've been taking on real directly through the coalition, because we have to talk about the most difficult subject for us to talk about is race. And so far too often we don't have a space or a way to be able to talk about our racial differences, the impact of a number of things that Ruby was just sharing with us as it relates to our historical ways of operating. So through the coalition, we're doing some very intentional work, and this again is just some of the things that I wanted to share with you that we're doing as it relates to addressing gun violence. So we have been looking, along with law enforcement, there's a group of us working on a project that we call CU Fresh Start, that is looking at those individuals that are most likely to be involved in gun violence as a perpetrator or a victim, and trying to figure out how we can reach them and reach out to them to get them involved in wonderful organizations like Marlon's First Followers group that he talked with you about. We as a community have to look at First Followers as the type of organization that we've got to invest in. It's important that this organization, whose mission and focus is to work with formerly incarcerated population, needs supports, resources, access to jobs, housing. We can't expect and ask people to make change if there's nothing for them to change to, right? So as a community, we've got to take that on and commit to that. We also are doing a great deal of training on the impact of trauma. And so these wonderful mothers that came here today, I just have so much respect, and I've learned so much about the impact of violence on them and on us as a community. Our schools are really a place where we're starting to work with young people. So over the last year and a half, we've started seeing our shooters becoming younger and younger. And so where are guns? How are kids getting access to guns? Where are the guns coming from? Those are real issues that we have to tackle and address. We have a response task force in place now so that we are bringing resources and supports into those neighborhoods and families that have been involved in gun violence. We are looking at targeted programs for youth. We're putting a group of social workers and mental health therapists together to be able to provide, as Ms. Johnson shared with us today, supports, resources, counseling, the necessary things to help people transition as best as possible from that tragic loss. And then we're addressing the police community issues that far too long have been a divide between black communities, low-income communities, and police. There's trust issues that we have to address and break through so that, again, those neighborhoods and residents see law enforcement as part of the solution and not part of the problem. And the same for law enforcement. I think someone mentioned about how difficult that is a work environment for them. So we have to address that as a community. We are through the coalition. So we have to just expand opportunity, exposure, and experience for far too many people who have been locked out. So I hope we hear that today as our opportunity as a community. I could go on and on, but I'll stop there and just want to say thanks for coming out today. This is a great community that we have here, and we have to do everything we can to keep it that way and take it to the next place. Thank you.
So I want to talk about parenting in the midst of violence and fear, finding meaning and transcendence, but I'll talk about both kind of the the traumas we've heard from stories before of the violence, and then also ways that mothers attempt to find meaning and transcendence, both after losing a child, but then also what it means to try to raise children in environments that often could be deadly. And so I want to give some context in terms of environments and what it means. I'll start with this one. And this one talks about social determinants of health, and it really stresses the importance of understanding the history of the U.S. in terms of marginalizing groups and what it means when people are prevented from having the resources that they need to be human and to raise their children and to be healthy and well. On from slavery, that first picture is of my grandmother's sister. My great aunt, my grandmother's sister, she took care of her grandmother who was a slave. And I used that picture to show how recent in U.S. society slavery is, Jim Crow oppression and other forms of racial segregation that we see play out in Chicago and here and other areas when people are segregated from resources. So that's part of the larger context. When we talk about the macro level, that's part of what we're also seeing and what we're trying to address. And I'll go back here, right? And so some of the other groups, right? Trail of Tears, in terms of immigrants, all of it plays out into some of what we're seeing now. And then there's a documentary, Unnatural Causes. Raise your hand if you have seen it. Yeah, really recommend it. And the subtitle is Inequality Making Us Sick, right? And the answer is a resounding yes, right? Social inequality is deadly. And so David Satcher, the former U.S. Surgeon General, he did a study where he found that there are 83,000 excess deaths of African Americans each year, and he says it's equivalent to a plane full of African Americans falling out the sky every day, every year. And excess death is when people die more than what you would expect from old age or more than what you would expect from diseases that may circulate in the population, right? Meaning, again, something unnatural is happening that people are dying. And then Rodriguez and his colleagues, 2013, they did research and studied from 1970 to 2004, and they found 2.7 million excess deaths, right, in the Black community. Again, when I talk about structural inequality, that's how it's playing out. And I also have the image of The Other America. Michael Harrington, right, in the 60s, he wrote the book and influenced public policy with the war on poverty. And then also I have the image of A Hidden America. And David Ford, who's an ABC News correspondent, he and Diane Sawyers, they did a special where they talk about a hidden America where people are raising children in environments that are unfathomable, right? Meaning that most of us in that room, and I include myself in the count, is that it's really hard for us to understand what it means to have that exposure to violence on a constant level and what it means to lose a child to violence, right? And so I want to put this here in terms of context and help us understand. And then also help us understand, right, this need for health equity. And you see the boxes, right, that everyone, they do not have the same box or number of boxes, right? That's what you get when you think about equality. But equity is about those who need more, that they should get more, right? Those who have been marginalized due to different forces that they may need additional resources to be healthy and well. And so a little about my project. So I study how the violence in Chicago affects Black mothers' mental and physical health. We did focus groups, and we asked the mothers for their blood because I want to do some genomic analysis. Work with Jean Robinson and Brent Roberts and Sandra Rodriguez-Zoss. And we wanted to see how mothers who perceive that their neighborhoods aren't safe, how that affects the genes that regulate their immune system, right? So that's kind of trying to answer some of these questions about excess death, what happens to the body that's under extreme stress. And so we also just kind of asked mothers about their neighborhoods, right? What do they find troubling about the neighborhood, but also how does it help them with their children? And then also the effects of gun violence on their mental and physical health. And it was interesting in terms of the study. Like, first of all, we didn't think black women would give us their blood because of the systemic entrenched racism that often occurs in medicine. And they did, and I say because they were interested in what was happening to their bodies, and I'll give you more information about that later. And during the last 2 weeks of the study, we were at the YWCA in Chicago on 63rd and Cottage Road, and the place was packed, right? There were women from door to door, and there was a long line of women out the door, to the point that we had to create a waiting list and shut down because we didn't have enough funding to do all the analysis. But it told us that black women were interested in research, they were interested in trying to understand the link between stress and health, and then also the money was important. We gave them $40 for the interview and for the blood sample, and I listened as some of the mothers divided that $40 into so many ways. So it was really interesting and humbling to have that. And so I put this slide in because I want to talk about the complexity of lived experiences, and of course the image that many of us probably know very well is both an image of a young woman and of an older woman. And I put down at the talk a wonderful TED Talk, and it's called The Danger of a Single Story, and it talks about when you think about groups, especially marginalized groups, especially groups of color, that you want to be careful of not having a single story about that group.
So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them.
And again, coming from a deficit perspective, right, to think about the challenges, but then also the resources that individuals have. And as researchers, but also community members, as policymakers, I put the image on your right in the corner, right, to just say that we have to be really open for knowledge and for understanding in different ways that we may not be used to experiencing it. And also this picture I put to talk about the resiliency that's in the Black community. First picture on your left is about in 1885, right, groups coming together to understand cotton, corn as economic development. Margaret Walker, who's a wonderful poet, wrote a poem, For My People, and just kind of talk about the complexity of African-American culture, African-American life, as they love, thrive despite depression, but then also are affected by depression, the complexity. So we're in a church now. Anyone want to tell me what you see in the picture, the one on the bottom on your left? Who can tell me what's happening in that picture?
It's like a Bible being dropped, maybe?
Bible being dropped, okay. Good, that's true.
She's being filled with the Spirit.
Right, so being filled with the Spirit, right? And that's a big part of Black culture, this rejuvenation, right? This belief that things can get better, this belief in a higher power. With the Annie Lee, I talk about this one as someone who may have a job that's difficult, right? Job that's not paying a lot, but each Monday, right, you put your feet on the ground, you get yourself together, and you go to work to feed the children and do whatever you need to do. And then the last image is double dutch. I spent my youth jumping double dutch, loving it from sun up to sundown, right, on the weekends and stuff. And even now, I have a double dutch rope in my car, right? So again, just kind of in ways where you're free, where you're able to be a child, and sometimes you can't, right, in certain neighborhoods, because to be out there in the streets is vulnerable. To be out of this eyesight of your parents is making you vulnerable. So this is a quote about Black women, beauty and resiliency. We asked them, what is it like to be a Black woman? And so one person said that Black people, we got naturally beautiful skin, that we don't have to wear makeup. And then another mom, I won't read the whole quote, but basically she's just saying that what's amazing is from slavery and other forms of oppression that we are still here, and that we are governors, we are professors and other things. And so this is a documentary that we're working on, What's Left Behind, and it's about mothers and families who've lost adult children to gun violence. And I was going to give you a trigger warning because it is difficult to watch, just as it's difficult to hear the stories of mothers who have lost their children to gun violence.
It was about 4 o'clock in the morning. I knew it was a bad call simply because of the timing.
I had to work that day. I worked the overnight shift at the time.
And I was sitting in my bed watching TV.
And I told Gerard, stay in the house.
And he was like, oh, Uncle Julian, I'll be right back. Then that never happened.
I was scared. I was scared to death.
I have some bad news, and it doesn't look good.
By the time I was running out the house, I see my cousin Tiara. She was at the corner and she was like hysterical.
I prayed that he was just hurt.
And so you get down there and what happens?
I arrived on 67th Street. No police officers there would answer my questions.
Then the police came and they roped off the area.
They're like, can I help you, ma'am?
I said, wait a minute, I'm his mom. Let him hear my voice.
So by the time I got to the corner, that's when I saw him.
He was under a sheet.
I was just empty. How he gone and I'm still here. That's not right.
And I used to hear that childbirth was the worst. But no, it's the ultimate anguish that you can feel.
But I was trying to suppress the screams. I couldn't stop myself from screaming.
What became clear to me, even though you get a lot of different outcomes when someone is exposed to trauma, is that it can really be very harmful to you psychologically.
And so after that, I just felt like I didn't want to live.
Because my thing was the world was supposed to stop when my son got killed. See, I was confused. I thought the world was supposed to stop.
And what's your son's name?
Damien.
My son's name is Thomas Lee. My son's name is Corey Parker.
My son's name is Raymond W. Pryor IV. My son's name is Kenneth Anthony.
I'm the mother of Gerard Benton.
My son is Ashton Simpson, and he was murdered September 13th, 2015.
But it really just shows the intense grief and the intense pain that mothers experience when they lose their children. And you saw here from the testimony, one mother talked about she was in bed for 4 years, right? Like it devastated her. Some of the other mothers talk about feels like their stomach has been ripped out. One mother says feels like her child lives in her neck and the pain is so intense And then another mother said that she couldn't taste food after her son was killed. One of the things that they did was to cook meals and eat and all of that. And once he passed away, like, she wasn't able to taste food anymore. So extreme cost to this gun violence. And then also the mothers talked about psychological, physical costs, had headaches, backaches, hair falling out, many things like that. And then when we asked, do you see physical signs of stress, one of the mothers said, I guess it's my hair loss. So it's kind of hard for me to read it. So it's not here. Let's see. Can I take this out? Right, so she says, I guess it's my hair loss, but my mom's hair is like that too. So that might be from her stressing too, because on the sides, my hair has fell out so bad, I don't care what nobody tells me, it ain't coming back. So I'm thinking it's from stress. And then sometimes I do have back problems, and I think it's from not drinking water. Then she kind of laughs. So you know what I mean? It might be stress. I just don't notice it. But like I said, the migraine headaches, that come from stress too. So like I said, I try not to stress because I know it'll kill you. And she's not the only one. Just over and over again, we heard that. But I want to say that my black women in the academy, right, black faculty, and especially in predominantly white universities, we talk about headaches, backaches, stomach aches, hair falling out, panic attacks, right? So things that we share across class is racial discrimination and what that does to the body. And so here is Alex, who was a mother of 5, whose son was attacked on the bus. And we asked the mother, so how do you cope? Like, how do you manage? And she said, you have to digest it and move on, because this is what happens every day. If you let it affect you, you won't be able to function. And then another mother in the group said, yeah, you're going to be messed up. You're going to be crazy for real. And then another mom, I won't read it, but she had a lot of trauma early on, and she was in domestic violence. She was looking for housing, just a whole list of challenges. And I said, so tell me how stressed you are. And I'm thinking, well, I already know what she's going to say. Well, she said, I'm not stressed. And I said, okay, that's interesting. So if someone would hear your story, they would think you have a lot of stress. And she's like, no, the Bible says if you pray, don't worry, and if you worry, don't pray. And I said, and so that works? And she's like, yes, if I pray, then I don't worry about it. Well, one thing we're also trying to do with our research is to link what she says also to her genomic analysis, right, to see like if her immune system is kind of going along with what she's feeling and thinking. And then this is a quote of Destiny, who lost her 16-year-old son. Both of them were carjacked. The 16-year-old was killed. And she talks about the anger over his death, but then also how she found meaning. She says, I couldn't bring my son back because my son was on loan. I'm a great believer that all of us is on loan. But I felt helpless of the fact and angry to a certain extent that someone had the unmitigated gall to just try to take my son. How dare you? You know how dare you just up and want to take something that's not yours? The helplessness came with the angriness for a minute. And I had to sit back and just thank God that it wasn't both of my sons. You know, he still allowed me to have one. He took his son back home and moved on to a better place. But what's astounding is that later she gave this quote, a son isn't born to be a killer, right? So although someone took her child, she was thinking that that child was not born like that, as we talked about earlier. And she talked about the social, the structural inequalities that shape those circumstances. And so one thing that we're trying to do to address this is to do research that involves the community, involves citizen scientists, and it's a way for them to come work with researchers, but also to drive some of the findings and hopefully to drive some of the solutions. I'll just talk briefly. When we did a study where mothers wore sensors for 30 days, we tried to do an exhibit in Inglewood and Chicago where community members could come, just like this, walk around and kind of understand the research. So quickly, this image is of gun violence that took place in a predominantly black neighborhood, Inglewood, versus a predominantly white neighborhood. In Inglewood, 191 shots, I think, and 191 calls to 911 about people hearing shots fired, and the red string represented that there were 42 individuals shot. And then in the predominantly white neighborhood, there were only, I think, like 21 calls with 0 people shot. And so we have the image on your right, the I Am a Child, it's from Civil Rights era, right, when there was I Am a Man. And we crossed out Memphis and we put Chicago, and we said that there are children growing up in both of those neighborhoods who deserve to grow up without the threat of violence. And that was part of our exhibit. This is just some other information we took. So they wore the sensors, and we wanted to see how when they hear the sound of gunshots, how it affects their physiology, right? The fight or flight response. I'm trying to capture that. We capture where they move around the city. We put together crime exposure reports that they could take to their policymakers and say, you know, in my community, this is what I'm exposed to. How can we work together to resolve these issues? And I'll just skip that in the interest of time. So I want to talk about, at the College of Medicine, what we're trying to do in terms of citizen scientists, community scientists. And so part of my role is Assistant Dean for Democracy, for Diversity and Democratization of Health Innovation. And basically what we're trying to do is to make sure what we're doing in the College of Medicine gets out into the community, but that also the community can come in and hopefully drive some of the discoveries. And so each year we're having a make-a-thon. Raise your hand if you heard about it in February. We had our first one in February. Okay, we got to get the word out a little more. So here's getting the word out. We're having another one March 28th. So just kind of look at the website. But the idea is for anyone in this room with an idea around health or wellness can submit it. And then we had a, what we call a dolphin tank. So you heard of Shark Tank, right? So we had a kind of gentler version of it, dolphin tank, where we had 20 people do their pitches, and then we selected 10 individuals to receive $10,000 worth of resources to turn their idea into a prototype. And so this was just the image of the make-a-thon. We had a 4th grade class from Garden Hills who were in the semi-finalists, but they didn't actually win one of the coins, but we're still working with them. They wanted to create a calming space. And then also all of this is on the website, so this is just an image of all the 10 winners. One of them is someone from the community who is going to use miniature horses to work with children who have been traumatized. And then I just wanted to talk briefly for a minute about a MacArthur proposal that we submitted for $100 million, and it's to create a national mental wellness tour to address the mental health needs in the Black community. And so part of it, we want to bring together 100 Black organizations. We already have the psychiatrists, the psychologists, we have the Greater Washington Urban League, we're talking to the NAACP, we're talking to the Congressional Black Caucus, and this idea to address some of these issues related to gun violence, but other things related to poverty and stress in the Black community. And then the biggest part, and I'll end on this note, we want to work with 100,000 citizen scientists who will work with us, who will upload information about what it means to have mental wellness in the Black community, but also challenges and what affects that. So when we talk about public health and getting at things that are risk factors and things that are protective factors, this is one way we hope to do that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tracy. That was a wonderful summation of local issues, and it was great that you were able to come right from the conference in Indiana and bring what the most current thoughts are with there. We now have time to look at what's been said, what you've heard, and ask the presenters what they think. So I'll just take show of hands. I'll start over here and work across there, and then I'll work back. But if you have questions, address them to the specific speaker that you're interested in answering, and we'll see what we can do here in the next few minutes. Yes, sir.
To go back to the beginning of these talks today, I'm Ray Norton. I'm a member here, been here a long time, NRA member, whatever. Top 1% of gun owners in the country, according to Shane Claiborne's book, Beating Guns. We have to do something. We have to do a lot of things. Universal background checks, it keeps coming up. Illinois invented its own procedure for background checks. We are not part of the national background check. We have to do things our own way here. There are so many problems with that. It's how do you collect the information? What kind of information do you need? We don't get information. The National Background Check Group does not get adequate information from police departments, from courts, on what happens there. You get the mental health stuff, you get into HIPAA regulations and all kinds of privacy regulations there on your health records. So it's not a simple thing to do. And I think we need to point that out. I saw an interesting thing just yesterday. That magazine limits are not effective. New Jersey passed a law a year ago saying magazines were limited to 10 rounds. They had to be turned in if there were more than 10 rounds. There's fines, possible jail term. Not one magazine has been turned in the last year.
Other questions? Try to limit it to questions for the speakers. Yes?
I'd like to mention Mr. Parsons' comment about kids starting gun violence. Simple question, why? But I would also mention Tracy Dace's program here, the DREAM program. I don't know if you're familiar with it. But it's a wonderful program, starting with kids at a young age. Why are kids starting violence younger than they used to?
So if I said the way I should have said it is, I believe that our data is starting to show that our shooters are becoming younger and younger. We still are looking at that data, so I don't want to put it out as if that's a exact thing, but we are seeing more kids with possession of guns. We are seeing more kids with, I think Marlon uses the term gunplay as it relates to solving the conflict. And then we've had 2 deaths and a young man who was paralyzed in the last year from gun-related activity. I think we send kids messages all across the board that are in conflict with each other, right? So we're at war across the world, right? And they see from us as society that gunplay is how conflict is solved. And when you have young people, 14 through 18, who struggle with conflict, who struggle with what I'll call manhood, what it means to be tough. I think all those things are contributing to why and how our shooters are becoming younger and younger. And so it's a society thing, and until we address a number of those types of things, it's, we have a number of groups, programs that we've been working with youth, and one of the first questions we ask them, bringing them in, is how many of you have guns, have access to a gun, or know someone who has a gun? And there isn't, all the hands always raised when we ask that as a question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm James Kilburn, I'm co-director of First Followers. So I had a couple issues. The first, I wanted to just address the first 3 speakers. And your research was mainly data. And I'm just wondering if I'm wondering why you're
just focusing on data and how you see the value in particular of talking to people who are critically impacted by the issues that you're addressing in order to come up with a slightly maybe different kind of solutions and conclusions from what you gave us. So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on that, how that qualitative element might fit in. And secondly, I wanted to raise the issue of the fact that Champaign County has the 5th highest poverty rate of any county of the 102 counties in Illinois. So I'd like to hear, and I think that particularly from what the last 3 speakers have said, there's a connection between gun violence and poverty and the unequal distribution of resources. So I'd like to hear a little bit about, and I think this is also for the people that are here as well, how can we address some of the poverty-related issues in this county as a way of also addressing issues of peace and combating gun violence?
So the first 3 speakers, we'll just take you in order. Janet?
Great, thank you for the question. I'll take a stab at this. It's a critically important questions, and I think no easy answers. In the Annals of Internal Medicine paper that was just published last month, they do touch on this. I mean, I think, yes, data is needed, but in addition, it needs to be figured out, what are the questions to ask? Including taking into account some of the things that you had mentioned in terms of the impacts on communities and families and all of that. So I think it's more than data. There is qualitative information as well that I think is critically important. But a lot of it is, I think, there's been 2 decades of essentially no research on gun violence and firearm violence, so we're way behind the times. But we need to get going on this and start asking the questions and looking at all types of questions and information and data to help answer these really important questions. So they're critically important.
Andy?
Taking in order. Yeah, I agree. The only thing I would add is, I think what you're seeing today is the right way to do it. There are people who are really good at data, and there are people who are really good at doing qualitative research. And the more people who are really good at doing a piece of it, the better, as long as we get together and talk about these things. If I couldn't do the things that some of our other speakers do very well at all. So I view myself as one, stock in the portfolio or something. I do what I do, and I try to learn from the people who do other things that are really, really important as well.
Sheldon?
This is a multi-pronged problem, and there's no silver bullet, no pun intended. In essence, it's going to take multiple points of view to look at it, and I do certainly agree with Andy's point of view. People with skills, of a diverse set of skills, are needed to look at it from many different angles. It's like the elephant can be felt in many different ways, but collectively it's still an elephant. And that's why this panel is so important, because the diversity of experience, skills, and perspective is what ultimately will lead to the appropriate solution.
Question?
I have a second question about the issue of poverty and resources. That was for the other speakers. Thank you.
I appreciate that question, right? Because I think that's at the core of it. And even when we talk about public health and trying to think about root causes of things, I think about the American dilemma, right? The study about U.S. society that said we're moving towards 2 societies, separate and unequal, and what's the impact of that? So I think as we study the causes of violence, what's triggering it, I think a lot of these structural issues will come up and rise up. And I think that we do have to think about how can we create programs, avenues, pathways for people to be able to have their needs met and to basically live in a just society. So I really think one of the ways that we're doing it here, right, just to kind of think of an example, is with the free tuition that we're doing. And although it doesn't answer all the questions, because people still have to find out where they're going to stay, and then they have to eat, which can still be a challenge, But to open up the university and to have free tuition in that way, I think is one of the dramatic ways. But again, we have to ensure that all groups can come through the door, because it can be free, but if they don't have the preparation and the pathways to get to the door, then it doesn't really solve that either. But I totally agree in terms of employment, in terms of resources, in terms of education, in terms of mental health services, that we really have to think about those and invest in those in meaningful ways. And that's part of also when I talk about the 100,000 citizen scientists, for people to say what they need, what allows them to be well, and then to marshal resources around that.
Yeah, I think poverty is a key contributor, and I think I addressed it in my remarks that we have to do some intentional work to lessen the divides and create more pathways for access and opportunity. I do believe that's a very important part.
So, some of the with the young men that we're working with is that we offer them a stipend to come. And as I mentioned, with these individuals, as we sit down and we start to learn who they are and we build relationship with, we start to peel back the onion and really understand a lot of the issues that's really going on. And one that really leaps off for me personally is the piece about being able to be gainfully employed. And after sitting down, just building a relationship with them and talking to them, when I look at them and I see all the potential and all the ambition that's in there and that's just bottled up within them, but it's being overwhelmed and choked because of their conditions and their circumstances. So when we talk about the macro level of issues that we have, I've been on the university campus. Well, actually, I'm from Champaign, but I've been on the university campus for the last 6 years actually, studying for my PhD. But as I walk through campus and I'm going to my office or going to class, I'm seeing all these structures just being erected. These buildings, millions and millions of dollars are just poured into the university. And at the same time, as I look, you see this exact same, you don't see anybody of color on these job sites. And so one of the things that we do, we're teaching them building construction trades, right? But we also know that there's the opportunity for access has been closed. And what I mean by that, when you talk about from a historical context, and you really dig deep into the history, you talk about it's always been like that. Certain populations have been shut out. We talk about the labor unions here. There was a study done by the Department of Labor, I think, or the School of Labor here in Champaign, maybe back 2015, 2016. And it was ridiculous to see the lack of diversity within these labor unions. And for an example, you might see, I think, just pull it off, don't quote me on this, but when I saw maybe 2 electricians that's in the labor union over the last decade, I mean, that's unacceptable. Because I spent 17 years as an electrician. I learned how to do it because of my passion for it. I went to school for it. But when you look at these individuals, these young men that never have been given the opportunity, and like I said, you talk about, the education system. I mean, it's failing certain groups of people. It's flat out failing certain groups of people because if you can't reach, you can't teach. And we're able to reach these individuals on a level that, you meet them where they're at. There's no big eyes, little U's. You meet them where they're at, and then you start to build, and you start to uplift. But the challenges that we're seeing from first followers' perspective is being able to connect them to work, gainful employment, after they're going through our 6-month program. That's one of the issues, that's a challenge. And I don't see the resources, for another example, I think I spoke about this at the Community Coalition maybe a couple weeks ago about how you look at the Uniform School District and how it's revamping and remodeling and building. It's a $184.3 million project. But they don't have any diversity goals at all. So when you talk about racist ideas that lead to racist policy, then that leads to practices and conditions that we see today. And that's period, and that's just plain and simple. I mean, oftentimes people don't want to hear that, but that's the world that I live in. I'm not sure where everybody else is living, but that's what I see on a continued basis.
Amen.
I'm going to stand up. This isn't going to reach where I'm sitting. I just wanted to reinforce and echo what Tracy has talked about, the involvement of younger and younger people in gun violence, and especially from what I've seen over the last couple of years. I get briefed on every shooting that occurs in the community, and it seems like they are younger and more frequent. For example, just a week ago Thursday, there was a shooting at Cottage Grove near Colorado. 15-year-old was shot in the elbow. The shooter was another 14 or 15-year-old, and this had ties back to I believe the fights at the Urbana High School that occurred earlier in the spring. 2 weeks ago today, a 15-year-old ran into a store crying for help. He was bleeding. He was shot in the groin. It turns out it was a self-inflicted, well, not self-inflicted, it was an accidental shooting. He had been walking around carrying a loaded gun tucked into his waistband. There was a shooting on Romaine Street several weeks ago. It was reported initially as a drive-by shooting. That was an accidental shooting. Younger, he was probably closer to 20, but he was driving around with a loaded weapon in his vehicle, accidentally shot himself in his foot, but he stopped the car and then fired several shots in the air. Initially reported it as a drive-by shooting, but it turns out it was accidental. So people are handling guns with no idea of the power that they have to harm themselves, not to mention others. And then there was a tragic shooting last year when a 15-year-old child, a 15-year-old boy shot his friend accidentally because they had a gun in the home and injured a 17-year-old. So these kids are getting access to loaded weapons in the home and in vehicles. And here's another story from the streets. This summer in July in Urbana, there were 30 reports of burglaries from vehicles. In every single time, 99% of the time, these are for unlocked vehicles. And every community coalition meeting that you go to in the last night, how long have we been having the meetings, Tracy? As long as we've been having community coalition meetings, when they talk about vehicle burglaries, 99% of those vehicle burglaries are from unlocked vehicles. Well, here's the thing. Among things stolen from those vehicles, Social Security cards, laptops, gaming systems, driver's licenses, valuables, 3 weapons, 3 guns. And those were just the ones reported stolen. There were probably more, but people aren't always reporting that. So now there's 3 weapons on the street that we have no idea whose hands they ended up in. And when you look at who's burglarizing vehicles, it's most often teenagers. It's young people. These are crimes of opportunity. They know there are things in the cars they want, including weapons. And so we've got people driving around with weapons in their cars, leaving them in their cars, unlocked, sitting in their driveways, which are just an invitation and easy access. So I'm just becoming more and more convinced that, number one, among everything else we're focusing on here, we have got to start talking about storage of guns and responsible ownership of guns and figuring out where these guns are coming from and where they're going. But the good news is all the wonderful programs that have been started. Marlon showed the Goal Getters as one example of working with kids in this age group. We've started a similar group in Urbana, the Self-Made Kings. It's on a smaller scale, but over the summer, our community outreach coordinator, Preston James, has been working with a group of 10, 13, 14 and 15-year-olds. These were the kids who were frequently in contact with authorities at the high school, had been involved in the fights at the high school in the spring. So they were the kids who were considered to be the ones who needed, the most help and the most support, and that's where we started. And they were paid a stipend to attend. So being able to earn money and have a way to obtain things that they want is important, and that starts when they're young and it continues into adulthood. Earlier this spring, and this is another story, Stone Creek Church came to see me, pastor and people from Stone Creek Church, and they wanted to know, and this was following the incidents at Urbana High School, and they said, what can we do to help? And so we tossed around a bunch of ideas. One of them was adopt a school. So Stone Creek Church has adopted Urbana Middle School. So it's not in a religious sense, it's in a sense of, doing whatever they can to support the teachers, faculty, students, and staff at the school. So for example, on the first day of school, two first days of school, I joined them, they welcomed all the students back to school. They have painted and fixed up the faculty lounge so the teachers have a place to go. That had been ignored apparently for years, so now the faculty lounge is fixed up. And they're working, mentoring students. And more recently, another church at Anderson in Florida, and I can't remember which one that is, but they've adopted Wiley School. Wiley School, if you know, is one of the two schools in Urbana that is in the lowest 5% in the state in terms of student achievement. So they can use some extra help, and they've taken on that school. So there are things that the community can do that it's a very positive steps. Cranert Center, Sam Smith has taken, through the Peace Project, has worked with the neighbors on Vaughter Street. In the 2000 block of Vaughter Street a few years ago was the scene of gun violence, murder, drug deals, and today, in fact yesterday, we had a celebration, we had a carnival, the neighbors were out in the street. We've renamed that block Silverwood, unofficially. And it's through the intentional action of many, many different groups, including Sam Smith, Cranert Center for the Performing Arts, Community Coalition, Park District, Urbana Rotary, the City of Urbana, intentionally and very actively focusing on that block. So things can be done, but the kids are getting hold of these guns, and we have got to really, I think, start focusing efforts on how this is happening and why, and figuring every step we can take to minimize the weapons in the hands of these kids. We'll all be better off. I don't want to sit next to another mom who's buried her child. I mean, we've just had it. And if you want Mitch McConnell's phone number, I can give it to you after the meeting. And I can tell you most of his numbers, the voicemail is full and they won't take messages, but I found the one where you could still leave a message. And seriously, I have his number. He should not be allowed to block any discussion of gun regulation at the federal level. So there you go.
Another question down here, and then we'll end it because we've run over time here.
Yeah, I had one comment and one question. James Corbin, better known as Tiger, I work at First Followers.
Could you come up and use one of the microphones?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, my name is James Corbin, better known as Tiger. I work with First Followers. I do the drop-in center. And I had a comment and a question. The comment first, I'm originally from Chicago. I'm in a wheelchair from gun violence. I got shot. I have a .357 slug still in L1. So I go through, I understand the constant struggle of you trying to get well, and they label it as a disease, and but that just means it's going to consistently get worse until it just take me out eventually. So it's a constant struggle. But I also understand what drives a lot of the fear, because I have seen shooters as young as 12, 9, coming from Robert Taylor and them areas. So I understand what drives the fear. They don't have anyone to trust. They feel like they can't go to law enforcement, because law enforcement is not seen as a helper, it's seen as an occupied force. So that's one thing. fear is another thing. You got to travel through, like in Chicago at the time, I had to travel through Inglewood, several other different neighborhoods just to get to Dunbar. I'm going through about 4 or 5 different gangs. You're not thinking about school. You know, you're thinking about survival. Most of the time of the day, I'm figuring out a route in my head that I could get, you know, less conflict. So I understand what goes on in these young guys, and that's the same thing that's driving these young guys here, because I was involved even talking with the guys over there at the Urbana with that whole incident. And a lot of this is they can't go to law enforcement. So they figure that they have to take care of this themselves. So that's what's driving it. And then there's the next, the ideology of I'd rather get caught with it than caught without it. So that's driving, you know. But my question is for Ruby. Yeah. On your study, you said you took the blood. What level of cortisol, like stress hormones, was there? Because we know that stress also blocks thinking. And there was a study where they took rich kids versus poor kids, and they outdid them academically eventually, but it was just due to stress restructuring the brain to only focus on this base level. Did you see those results?
And so that was kind of what one of the moms talked about, was like you have to have this tunnel vision, right? Like you can't kind of attend to the other things that are happening. So in terms of the genomic findings, so in terms of glucocorticoid receptors, right, that kind of move cortisol through, the women who perceived that their neighborhoods were not safe, like they had higher levels of that kind of circulating. And so we are trying to do more research to better understand that. So yes, in other words, it seems like the stress, that it does take a toll. And it's interesting that it was perceived stress. And that could be because we didn't measure objective stress as well. We measured like a 4-block radius, the number of violent crimes, but maybe there are other ways to measure it. But that's consistent with other research on loneliness that talks about how you perceive it. Like that's what's important. And I thought about what you said in terms of young kids who are in their mind thinking about how can I be safe, like where's the danger, and that's kind of revving up your body in terms of the fight or flight. So we do have some findings. We're still trying to work on it, but yes, it shows that if you perceive that your neighborhood is not safe, then that does affect the cortisol.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very, very much. Let's have another round of applause. And I would give a round of applause to all of you in the audience for your rapt attention, for your good questions, for your attendance today. We here at Wesley very strongly believe in these topics. I think I've learned today, I suspect everyone else has learned as well. It is important for us to not just learn, but to act. You need to contact your representatives. I don't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or, like I am, an independent. Just write them and say what your thoughts are. But after hearing today, I would say that what we need is some money from Congress to look into this in a manner that will study the best way to approach it. That there's no question we have gun violence. There's no question we have a crisis in this country. There's no question the black community in the cities is being decimated by gun violence. We have no question that suicides, especially I would address teenage suicides in the rural areas, which are largely white, from guns, that's permanent. These same kids, with a little counseling, a little help, would change their minds, because those who do survive, or those who were stopped soon enough, say, they didn't really mean it. You know, but you do a pills, you can reverse it. You do a gun, you can't reverse it. It's terrible. Anyway, again, thank you for coming. Contact your Congress people, see if we can't get some action going. And you can emphasize what we learned today. It needs to be at the grassroots level as well as the statistical level. Both are necessary. Both are necessary, coming together and hopefully create a situation where we will relieve this public health crisis. So thank you all for coming.